The sky has not been the same sky since the first distortion started. It hangs now like a bruise, a sickly, swollen dome that shimmers in the wrong places and droops in others, as if someone somewhere is tugging at the world and forgetting to let go. Light comes in ragged pulses. Shadows stretch and refuse to behave. Once familiar constellations blink out for minutes at a time, then reappear in the wrong order. We learned quickly that maps were polite lies. Where I sit and speak into this battered microphone, I can see the skyline of what used to be a city, but calling it a skyline is generous. Towers lean at impossible angles, their cores boiled out by whatever strange tidal pull now sweeps across the crust. Glass is gone in the places it mattered, blown into ragged curtains that still whisper in the wind, and concrete slabs have folded like paper. Bridges are collapsed halfway, their spans sagging into blocky teeth that catch whatever the wind is throwing now. Rusting cars, crates of things no one remembers the use for, the occasional skeletal tree that used to be whole. The sea, if I can still call the nearest ocean that misbehaves. On some days it swells with jealous hunger and climbs the coast in slick, slow waves that crawl up riverbeds and swallow whole neighborhoods. On other days it retreats so far that the old harbors look like sacrificial bowls of cracked salt, exposing long-drowned hulls and the bones of piers. Tides are no longer a rhythm but an argument. The gravity pulls and coughs, and the water decides where it will go by a whim. We learn to read the shore like a fever chart, the foam line, the debris patterns, the smell of brine in the wind. Each tells a story of a place that might be small and viable one morning and gone the next. Heat has a new grammar. Summers are not seasons so much as verdicts. For years the sun burned closer, and for years the rains refused. When rain comes, it is angry and slow, falling in sheets that melt roofs and wash away soil like someone rubbing out the map of the land. Fires start in places where they shouldn't, in scrubland that remembers nothing but wind, and in old gas stations where a stray spark finds all the fuel life left behind. Smoke hangs like a permanent apology in the air. It colors everything in ash and memory. Nights bring brittle cold so sudden it cracks saplings and shivers the bones of those who sleep without shelter. Cities have become museums of absence. Hospitals are silent mausoleums of untagged charts and rusted gurneys. Libraries are nests for rats and the occasional human who reads between the lines of a world that no longer makes sense. Institutions that were supposed to organize us, governments, supply chains, the neat hierarchies of bureaucracy, splintered first into directives and then into rumors. For a while, there were convoys that called themselves councils. For a while, there were broadcasts promising return to order. Those voices thinned. Now, authority is local. A man with a rifle and a map, a woman who can fix a pump, a group of teenagers who guard a well with nothing but a rope and a laugh. Law became barter and code, and the code varies block to block. Survivor groups exist like islands. Some call themselves communes and try to rebuild something that resembles trust. They scrape solar panels, share seeds, and barter for medicine. Others are tighter, smaller, hardened into raiding bands that remember the old world only as a set of things to be taken. Scavengers, that is, the ones who travel the broken highways in convoys of repurposed trucks, are less organized but more dangerous in their unpredictability. They will trade if you have something they value. They will take if you do not. Between these groups, there are people who inwardly fold, folks who move at night, who keep to basements and cellars, who stitch doors closed and whisper to the radio because the human voice is a balm. Technology is scavenged and repurposed. Solar arrays cobbled from broken panels, bicycles modified to drive pumps, radios kept alive by hand-cranked dynamos. There are still libraries of knowledge left in hard drives and smudged notebooks, but the machinery to use that knowledge is rare and delicate. Fuel is the new coin. A liter of diesel can buy a lifetime of silence or 3 days of warmth. Clean water moves like gold, guarded, measured, and celebrated with the reverence we once reserved for holidays. Nature has been both enemy and ally. Where vegetation persists, it does so by ferocity. Kudzu-like vines that claim an abandoned playground overnight, small, stubborn grasses that find their way through collapsed sidewalks. Predatory animals have adapted. There are packs that run the suburbs at dusk and birds that have become cleverer, stealing food from the very hands that feed them. The climate itself argues with the seasons, and weather reports are superstition, not science. There is a noise that underpins everything now. A low, steady hum in the earth on some days, a high-edged whine in the night on others. People whisper that the distortions have a voice. I call it the sound of the planet trying to settle and failing. We have learned to listen. We mark the days not by calendars but by events. The day the north wind dropped the power poles like dominoes, the week the river walked away. The night the gravity bubble held and a block of the old city floated for hours, casting a shadow like a ruined moon. Anxiety lives in the small things. The jagged edge of a ration pack, the first cough of someone at night, the way a child looks at a pack of matches like it is a miracle. There is uncertainty because nothing is stable long enough to be trusted. But there is movement too, a nervous, stubborn insistence on being humane in small ways. We still trade bread, still trade stories, still sing quietly when daylight fails. Those fragile acts, the sharing of a cigarette, the barter of a book, the keeping of a promise to check on a neighbor, are tiny rebellions against the new geometry of the world. This is what the world looks like now, fractured, unpredictable, and somehow still decidedly human. We are learning to make maps from memory and to watch the sky for moods instead of weather. I broadcast into the static because voices keep things alive. Names matter. Places matter. Even when gravity forgets the rules, we try to remember them for ourselves. They used to call me Miles Harrington on the air because it sounded like a name that could belong to someone who'd worn a suit and gone to a meeting. It fit the radio better than my real name ever did. Less baggage. Easier to remember when people's ears are brittle from hunger, and their patience is thinner than the paper we used to print our letters on. Miles is the name that opens my mouth when I switch the transmitter on. It's the name that lets me be the voice other people lean toward at night, when the world creaks and the gravity distortions make the lamps flicker like questions. I keep the studio in what used to be a second-floor office of a collapsed bookstore. The shelves are gone, the books reduced to a kind of mulch where rain reaches them. But the room is dry, a miracle of angles and tattered insulation, and that counts for everything now. There's a hand-cranked dynamo, bolted to an old bicycle frame in the corner. Pedal long enough and the bulb hums. Spin it longer and the transmitter coughs to life. I run the generator twice a day, at dawn for an hour, at dusk for 2. The rest of the time I sleep, fix things, or walk the perimeter, listening for other human sounds. Survival is a series of small, stubborn rituals. In the mornings I check the rain barrels, 3 of them welded together from a collapsed supermarket's tanks, and skim the surface for oil sheens and dead things. We filter through layers, a coarse mesh cloth to catch leaves, sand and gravel to strip larger particulates, and a final pass through a charcoal bed I made from burned hardwood. It's not perfect. When the river runs thin or the sky forgets how to cry, we boil what we have, and that means preserving fuel like it's a prayer. A single canister of propane is a sacrament. We measure cups of boiled water like commandments, rationing out the small miracles to the people who promise to share their meat with us and return the favor. Food is scavenged and coaxed back to life from the bones of the old world. I smoke what meat we can find, hang strips of fish over a low fire for days until they're leathery and blessedly stable. We trade seeds with a commune 2 miles down the road, brittle packets of tomatillo and bean saved from a greenhouse that someone braved the distortions to raid, and then returned from with hands shaking and pockets heavy with hope. I grow what I can in small beds beneath broken skylights, shepherded by tarpaulins in prayer. I learned to graft a tomato plant to a rootstock of near-dead vine, and watched a fruit stubbornly turn red like a small sunrise. Those are the kind of miracles that keep you pedal spinning at 2 in the morning, while the world tries to fold itself into something unrecognizable. Shelter is less about walls and more about angles. Gravity isn't trustworthy. We build low and heavy where we can, pinning rooms down with metal and sandbags so they don't decide to drift off in a gust of distorted pull. The roof is a patchwork of corrugated metal and a solar blanket ripped in half, stitched together with wire and stubbornness. I sleep with my boots within reach. I never leave the radio unguarded. Voices come and go, and you learn quickly that silence can be more dangerous than any raider. Weaponry is improvisation. A rifle scavenged with a chamber that jams more often than not. A length of pipe sharpened and wrapped in leather. But the most important weapons are quieter. A radio tuned to pick up other frequencies. A ledger where I write names and times of broadcasts. A list of people who answered and where they said they were. There's a map on my wall, not a printed thing anymore, but a living web of strings and torn postcards marking caches, friendly doors, wells that yielded for a season. The strings tangle, snap, and reroute. Each time someone answers and says, "Miles, it's me. I'm on the 3rd floor of the blue slate building by the pier," I knot a new thread. Names are currency. Recognition binds people to one another. It is how we make small communities out of the ragged edges of what's left. I keep going for reasons that look different in the light and the dark. There is the obvious. Survivors I've promised to listen for. A child named Jara who used to call the show and ask for stories about clouds that used to be sheep. A woman named Ruth who fixes pumps and always sends bits of oil in trade for batteries. There is also responsibility. I used to be a teacher, or at least I thought I might be, before everything else was stripped away. The voice on the radio remembers things people forget when they starve or when their nights are full of noise. Names, birthdays, the way the old world pronounced words. I keep those names like anchors. When I read them aloud in a breathless, cracked radio voice, Maria Alvarez, 3rd floor stairwell, east side. Check in if you can. I am doing more than broadcasting. I am telling someone that they still exist to someone else. That matters in a world that wants to whisper you away. My losses are not tidy. They accumulate like sediment. I had a family. Lena, who loved soup and would tell me I sang off-key when I tried to hum a lullaby. Theo, who could fix a carburetor with chewing gum and the kind of stubborn faith in physics we no longer have the luxury of exercising. The night the gravity event first collapsed the bridge and the river turned crooked, they were on the other side. I remember the radio call full of static and their laughter, and then the long, impossible silence. For a while I rode out into the rubble searching, calling their names into rooms that answered only with drafts. The search taught me a terrible lesson. Hope can be a sharp thing. It can keep you alive and it can break you when it's wielded without care. I came back with pockets full of things that were not them, and a voice that had to learn how to keep living even when the heartbeat you were listening for doesn't respond. Guilt is a constant companion. Guilt because I stayed at the transmitter when I could have gone looking again. Guilt because I sent packages of food to a group 3 blocks over and later heard they were raided the same night. The cans stolen and the people taken. Guilt because sometimes I choose the comfort of a voice on the radio over the risk of looking at another person's grief in the eyes. I carry all of it, and I confess it on air sometimes, because confession is a lighter load when you say it and someone else says back, "We hear you." There is also an education in solitude. I learned to solder by comparing the smell of melted tin at 3 in the morning with the smell of fried onions. I relearned mechanics by dismantling a generator until its soul was exposed, and then putting it back together with a prayer and a borrowed spring. I learned to read weather again by looking at the way the dust rises in a particular pattern before the tremors. Survival taught me small rituals. How to sterilize a wound with boiled tea. How to fashion a splint from a strip of a billboard and hope. How to barter a dental tool for a day's worth of milk. Those skills are not romantic. They are the practicalities of staying upright while the earth is trying to rearrange you. Yet, despite the ache and the weariness, there is a soft insistence to being human that keeps me returning to the microphone. People need something more than ration lists and coordinates. They need to hear a story about a dog that learned to fetch a broken radio antenna, about a woman who painted a mural on a collapsed viaduct to make the children laugh, about the day someone found a tin of peaches and shared it with 16 people, and no one lied. My broadcasts are not only survival updates, they are small anchor points of civilization. I read recipes because food remembers being comfort, and I read poems because words are tiny scaffolding for hope. I read letters I find tucked in drawers, and I say the names out loud because saying them stitches them back into reality. Sometimes someone answers, not always. Sometimes it's only static, the ocean of noise between us. But sometimes a voice comes through, shaky as a leaf and alive, and that single signal can make an entire day worthwhile. It becomes proof that what I do matters. It becomes proof that maybe, just maybe, when gravity forgets how to be, human memory will remember how to hold one another upright. So I keep spinning the pedals and patching wires and speaking into the microphone. I keep lists and light small fires and patch up the radios that don't deserve to die. I keep going because names matter, because small economies of kindness matter, because I promised a child I would keep telling stories about clouds shaped like animals until real clouds returned. I keep going because there are moments when the world stops being a bruise, and for an instant, the sun behaves like it used to. And I can hear a laugh through the static that sounds enough like the old music to make me pedal faster and believe in the future for another day. They call it the grav surge now, 2 words that taste like metal when you say them out loud. The first time it hit properly, people tried to call it an earthquake, then a storm, then a miracle. Those were polite words for things we could measure. This is not polite. This is a ripple in the architecture of weight itself. It folds cities, upends rivers, and makes the ocean think twice before behaving. It started with nights when the moon seemed to wobble, and the streetlight outside my window went soft for a long minute. Then a block of apartments drifted up like a slow, horrified jellyfish, and hung over the highway for 3 hours before dropping back down, and shearing a tram line clean off like it was a twig. That's the crisis at the heart of what we face. Gravity is unreliable, and every time it hiccups the planet rearranges a little of itself. Soil shifts, aquifers slosh in directions that surprise us, and structures built for a single, polite constant suddenly have to survive a variable they were never designed to take. The physics teachers told us, and I repeat this on the air because names and facts still matter, that gravity is a function of mass and distance. You move the mass, you skew the pole. When whole slabs of crust get tugged, or when pockets of air alter density over a city, you get local distortions. Gutters that flood sideways, bridges that fold, and waves that climb hills. The practical effects are what make this a daily, livable nightmare. Water is the first casualty you notice when the world forgets its rules. Rivers now morph into tricksters. One week they are deep and faithful. The next they are a string of disconnected ponds with fish gasping in pockets of drought. Tidal surges come inland without warning when gravity decides the ocean should stand up and walk. We have seen waves climb where no one expected water to be, swallowing a market, leaving salt in the soil for a season. Wells that used to sing steady have either gone silent or started gushing brackish slop, because the aquifer they tapped slid sideways and mixed with something it shouldn't have. Food production collapsed in stages that looked like bad patience. First, the pollinators left for good. Bees and some birds altered their migration because flowers bloomed at the wrong times. Because gravity made the wind patterns inconsistent and temperatures swing like a mood. Crops that learned to trust seasons found those seasons missing. Greenhouses cracked when their frames experienced momentary lifting forces. Years' worth of seeds blew away during a microlift. That's how famine spreads. Quietly, then suddenly. The plants we could coax to live now do so under tarps, ballast, and prayer. You don't plant 3 acres anymore. You husband a few beds under a roof anchored by barbell plates and rusted rebar, and you celebrate when a tomato reddens like a small, defiant sun. Fuel and power are both scarce and sacred. The distortion events wrecked too much of the centralized infrastructure we depended on. Transmission lines that are supposed to be stable got kinked and failed. Pipelines flexed and leaked. Storage tanks split when their supports were stretched by a local bubble of low gravity. That means diesel, propane, and even bottled gas are rarities. We run the hand-crank dynamos, salvage what cells we can, and cycle the small solar sheets during the most reliable suns. Batteries are life. If you have a battery, you have light and calls and a way to pump water. If you don't, you barter for the day you get to charge something useful. I tell people on the broadcast to keep watch on their batteries' slow decline. Don't let them go dry, and never leave them at 100% either. Store them in a cool place. Discharge to about half if you can before long storage. Those are small, hard-won lessons that can stop a battery from becoming a brick. Society broke into smaller maps because large systems couldn't cope. Governments tried. For a while, you might have heard it. Bulletins promising stabilization, convoys of help, emergency protocols. They lasted until the first major grav burst took down a regional power hub and the supply chains that fed hospitals. Then they splintered into 100 versions of the truth. Now, you have communes that try to be governments on a block scale, phone tree networks of scavengers, and raider bands who think governance is a suggestion. Where resources exist, a well that still tastes clean, a solar farm hauled into working order, a cache of canned goods, the stakes are higher than they used to be. People kill over less now. Scarcity sharpens greed and blunts mercy. I have had good encounters and bad ones. Once, a convoy rolled up on the edge of our little map with flags stitched into their tarps. A sunburst painted on burlap, the sign of the Solstice Collective. They brought with them a barrel of water, a cracked pressure pump, and a guitar. For 3 days, we traded labor and stories. They showed me how they rigged a low-pressure pump to siphon a shallow aquifer and taught a trick to test for salt intrusion. You fill a clear bottle with water, let it stand, and smell for a metallic sting. It's crude, but it warns. Those folks left with our thanks and an exchange of seed packets and a promise to check back in a month. They were allies by measure and trade. The other times were less kind. Raiders come with a philosophy of force. They learn the geography the hard way, where water caches get refilled, which roofs still hold solar, which bridges lead to stores. We lost a small group of people who used to help maintain our perimeter after one of those raids, taken at dusk when they were fetching a crate of fuel. We tried to stop them. Someone fired a flare to warn the others. Bullets answered. That was a lesson in trade-offs. You can use your people as defense, or you can serve them for other work. There is no perfect calculus, only the weight of choices when your scale is broken. Survival gets harder each day because the baseline conditions keep eroding. It's not just that commodities are low. It's that the conditions that produce those commodities are unstable. Weather patterns oscillate more wildly. Soils erode where they used to be held by roots that no longer anchor because the plants failed. Pathogens behave differently when seasons shift. Storage gets scarcer because a sudden lift can fracture a barn and dump months of food into mud. People either burn through supplies faster to survive one immediate threat or hoard them and make long-term rebuilding impossible. And then there are the human costs. Exhaustion, the mental attrition of constant vigilance, and the moral erosion that happens when you start calculating who to save and who to leave. Practical, actionable advice I give on air is a mix of scavenger wisdom and makeshift engineering. If your well starts tasting metallic, or if the water begins to foam when it hasn't before, don't drink it. Boil if you can, bring water to a rolling boil for at least 1 minute, 3 minutes if you are above a high elevation and you have the fuel. Use a layered filter, coarse cloth, sand, charcoal. A charcoal bed will filter organics and improve taste, but will not remove salt. For salty intrusion, there are two obvious survivals. Desalinate small batches with a solar still, a shallow pan, a glass cover slanted to a catch container, or find groundwater farther inland or deeper. When aquifers shift, sometimes the cleanest water is down, not what's left near the shore. When buildings and roofs start to lift even slightly, anchor them. Use straps, sandbags, car tires filled with concrete if you can, and interlock roofs to lower panels so the whole mass balances more. Build low and heavy in areas that get regular lifts. Place ballast on potential floating pieces, rather than under sheltering canopies which will be caught like sails. When you move a generator, always trot a lashing line because the equipment can slip out of place under a microlift. Secure the fuel canisters separately and never store them under a tilted beam that might pinch and explode. Watch the sky for the first signs. The distortions rarely come out of pure silence. There is the shimmer, the way light bends in a ripple, like heat over an asphalt road. There is the low hum I talk about on the air, a deep vibration under your teeth 10 minutes before a surge sometimes, and the birds. If birds try to land and then launch again in a quick panic, that's your early warning. Get to open ground if you can't find shelter, but not too close to cliffs or riverbanks. Those edges collapse without warning. If you are in a vehicle, low gear, slow, and do not cross bridges that look like they have sagged. Those are points where the structure can snap under differential pull. Food preservation is another survival skill I repeat. Smoke small batches of meat over low heat for days. Salt works where it can, but with salt intrusion in water, it becomes a harder currency. Dehydrate where possible, thin slices of fruit across a screen in the sun, covered with netting to keep birds out, will become light and durable. Rotate your stores. Eat oldest cans first. Keep an inventory ledger, and mark dates even if the calendar has lost meaning. We are short on fuel, so travel must be purposeful. Plan convoys with redundancies, at least 2 non-commensurate routes, an agreed-upon check-in cadence on the radio, and a signal flare in case someone needs aid. Trade smart. Batteries for seeds, tools for clean containers, knowledge for labor. In many places, a skilled mechanic is worth more than a crate of sugar because he can keep a pump alive for months. There are other, less technical perils to contend with: disease, despair, and the spiral of violence. Medical care is limited. I encourage people to learn basic wound care, clean with boiled water, dress with sterile material if possible, and watch for signs of infection, red streaks, swelling, fever. Vaccination schedules were interrupted. Catch-up campaigns are patchy. If you have access to antibiotics, use them prudently and finish courses if you start them. If you can't get professional care, be wary of improvisations that could do harm. The devil of improvisation is useful, but know its limits. As for the science, when I explain it on air, I try to keep it simple and avoid turning the story into technobabble. Distortions come from mass redistribution and atmospheric density anomalies, large-scale ocean sloshes, tectonic uplift, and pockets of lighter than normal air that form over superheated plains. Heat leads to expansion. Expansion shifts the center of mass. The planet's crust is not a rigid shell, it flexes. When enough mass moves in a way the system doesn't expect, you get a local change in the pull. That change, magnified by geography and human-built structures, is what breaks us. It is useful to understand that this is, at root, a mechanical problem. Solutions will be part engineering, part patience, and part social will. The stakes are always rising because each crisis makes the next easier. A destroyed wetland doesn't absorb floods, and so a wave when it comes is sharper. A cracked aquifer lets salt creep in. A community lost to raiding makes the next village more isolated and exposed. We are running down a slope of compounding failure, and the work is twofold: to avoid making it worse today, and to build pockets of resilience that will hold when the next event comes. On the broadcast, I often end these explanations with a piece of actionable hope. Check your neighbors, share what you can, and document everything. Write down where wells are, what their taste is like, which houses are anchored and safe. If you have a device charged, back up names and coordinates and share them with someone else. Human networks are more valuable than any single stockpile. When someone answers the call and says, "Miles, we're at the old bakery. The pump's weak but the water's clear," suddenly that map matters. Suddenly the line between survival and catastrophe thins. We are not solving the planet here. We are learning a stubborn curriculum of endurance. Each morning I pedal the dynamo and speak these instructions into a microphone because knowledge spread is the only kind of artillery we have. The crisis is structural, messy, and ongoing. But knowledge, an extra hand, a sealed jar of water passed across a smudged table, those things bend the arc of the day away from disaster. They do not fix the world, but they buy us time. And sometimes, time is the only kind of miracle left. They say pressure makes diamonds. Out here, pressure makes decisions, small, ugly, unavoidable choices that pile up until you wake one morning and find you are someone else. The pressure this month has been a drumbeat at the edge of hearing. The water barrels have been lower than they should be. The seed packets we traded away to the Solstice Collective took longer to sprout than anyone expected, and half the seedlings burned under a sudden lift that skinned their leaves raw. Fuel has become an arithmetic of denial. Do I keep the generator one more dusk for another hour of calls, or do I save the canister for a surgical kit we might need? The more those choices stack, the less I recognize the man who sits down at the microphone and says, "This is Miles, you are not alone." It starts small, a missed check-in, a silence where there used to be a laugh on the line. Jara stopped calling 3 nights ago. She was 6, bright and insistent, and she used to ask for stories about clouds shaped like animals. I left a message the next morning and then another. Maybe she's with her mother at the mill. Maybe the raiders took them. Maybe the gravity pulled their rooftop apart when they slept. Rumors roll through the district like low, hungry clouds. They thicken and then break, and you never know which rain will be truth. We are running out of things that were already scarce. The well on 5th has been sputtering. The aquifer that fed it has been twitchy, brackish when the tide plays tricks on the coast. I rationed our water down to 3 liters per person per day, and even that felt like a luxury when we had to ready the pump for the people 2 blocks over who'd promised to trade watch shifts with us. Food is a ledger of trust. Canned beans from a raided grocery, a handful of salted fish, a half loaf of bread that was baked yesterday and will be stale tomorrow. Fuel is measured in heartbeats. A spare liter could mean 1 night of cooking or 3 days of lighting for the infirm. Then the raiders came earlier than they usually do now. They moved like a rumor with teeth. A convoy of low trucks and a half-dozen riders, blackening the horizon like someone had tried to smudge the sun. They hit the east approach, shouting and firing, and the sound of it snapped our street into a sequence of small violences. A window burst, a dog howled and then fell silent. A woman behind a door screamed and then made a choice I have come to know as the old trade of survival, silence. We tried to repel them with noise, with flares, with the small, stubborn violence of people who have held on to one another long enough to learn a language of defense. We lost 3 people. One of them, a young man named Arlo who used to mend radios for us, went out to draw their attention and did not come back. I described the raid on air because people need to know what corners of the map are burning. I said his name. I said, "If you find him, tell him Miles says he owes me a cup of coffee." Saying his name felt like a stitch. That night the sky did something new. A flicker in the stars like a camera shutter, and then a small, localized lift that took the shingles off the bakery and floated them across the street. They landed like a sentence half-written. It's capricious, the way the planet moves now, and caprice makes planning feel like a superstition. The raid was not just theft. It was a reminder that where we have weakness, someone else sees an opportunity. So when the message came through the shortwave at 2 in the morning, my hands were already a map of small fears. It was not a voice I recognized. It was a signal, clipped and careful, compressed words, a cadence like a code. The first time I heard it, I thought it was part of the static. Then it repeated. I turned the knobs, tuned down, tuned up, and finally let it play out in my headset. Hollow well, 7 degrees west of the old observatory, saltless, answers with the phrase, "We remember the map." The line went blank. For a second I could only hear my pulse and the old hum of the dynamo. I rewound the recording and played it back. The phrase could have been nonsense. It could have been a trap. It could have been salvation. Rumors in a world like ours are like seeds. You plant enough of them and a few will sprout. People called in, thin-voiced with sleep and hope. Someone said they'd heard of a place called the Hollow years ago, a sink where an old mining shaft met a freshwater vein, and people used to go when wells failed. Someone else said the observatory had been scrapped decades earlier when the first lifts started, but that memories live in concrete longer than they live in people. The dome might still be there, half buried and monumental, an antiquity with a pool beneath it. A caller named Ruth swore she'd heard a convoy go out 2 weeks prior to explore that general quadrant and return with jars of clean water she tasted herself. Another voice, quiet, older, warned me of raider interest. Every rumor sharpens appetite. I replayed the message a dozen times, each loop a liturgy of possibility and paranoia. On the air I did what I could to sound detached, professional. If anyone is near 7 degrees west of the old observatory, check your bearings, I said. If you have more information, identify with the phrase and we will coordinate. And be careful, we are not alone. The truth is I wanted to say more. I wanted to confess that I would walk to the Hollow in a week with a handful of people if the water was truly saltless. I wanted to plead. I wanted to ask who out there would answer a child named Jorah and tell her I hadn't forgotten to tell Cloud stories. Trust is a calculus I have been learning by fire. After the Solstice Collective left, we traded seed packets with our hands and left our backs exposed as a test. The trade went well, but I still wake at night imagining them with their guitar turned into a plow, or their water barrels stolen by somebody else on the road. Some people will help you because the memory of civilization leans them toward generosity. Some will exploit you because their moral compass is a gear that rusted. The Hollow rumor was a magnet. Hope draws iron. We began quietly to prepare. Preparations are not grand plans so much as small, distributed actions. Splice extra rope on the trucks, patch the pressure pump with brass from a clock, cache away 2 days' worth of hardtack sealed in a metal tin, mark the map. I walked the perimeter with Ruth, and a lanky man named Hoss who had a laugh like a rusted hinge, and a head full of ways to use a crowbar. We sharpened our wits more than our weapons. Hoss swore a look at the sky could tell you when a lift was coming, and he practiced the pattern until he could describe it blind. We also did what we always do, we broadcast. If you are heading to the Hollow, I told the static and the sleepers, announce at dawn and dusk on 7.9 megahertz. If you need escort, request it. If you are alone, do not go unprepared. On the air, I cooshed the urgency and civility. Off the air, I wrote down a list of people who answered affirmatively. Ruth with her pump skills. A pair of brothers with a pickup and a bed full of tires for ballast. A medic who goes by the name Myra and who promised she could pack enough antibiotics for a small extraction. The more names I wrote, the heavier the ledger felt. The ascent of fear is not only external. Inside me, a rusting geometry of horror and hope begins to shift. There is the practical fear that the Hollow is a trap, that raiders have set up a false beacon to lure convoys to be plundered. There is the ethical fear, if I go and the Hollow is real, do I keep the water for my people? Do I share it? If I don't share, I become what I resist. If I do share and too many know, there will be blood. I have been awake at 3 in the morning calculating trade-offs like a man, trying to keep a house of cards alive in an earthquake. Every plan I make is a gamble with human lives in the pot. And then there is the memory, stubborn and knife-sharp. I think of Lena, teaching Theo how to whistle with a blade of grass. I think of the night I called their names and only found debris. I think of Arlo, who went out during the raid. The worst mechanics of survival are the ones that ask you to choose between saving strangers and honoring promises to those already with you. I promised to keep voices alive, but promises have costs. The first outward sign that everything was going to mount into something worse came when the raiders began to get bolder. They hit 2 other communities in the district, timing their attacks between lifts when people were most likely to be spread thin. At midday, when a convoy was fetching a spare pump. At dusk, when lanterns were being lit. They moved in with a precision that suggested not a ragtag band, but a network that had learned the mathematics of scarcity. There is always someone who learns faster than the rest, someone who rationalizes cruelty as efficient survival. We responded by reinforcing doors and learning to be less visible. We started using decoys, empty cans chained to the periphery to simulate people moving, false flares set to mislead anyone watching from a distance. Survival plays a tired, small theater where you rehearse scenes you hope never to see performed. I spent one long night soldering together a battery rig that could jump a pump for a few minutes longer. That extra time could mean safe transfer of water. That extra time could mean a life. I sold the idea to a reluctant group by promising coffee, because coffee is the currency of certainty. People will risk for a cup of warmth. Rumors about the hollow hardened into scriptures when a radio operator with the call sign Old Compass answered one morning with coordinates and a clear voice that had seen too much. "It's not a trick," she said quietly. "We found clean water. There's a shaft and a cistern and it tastes like the first rain. We left markers, a stack of 3 stones with a black cloth on the eastern approach. But be warned, the road is watched." She gave a time she would return to scout again and a frequency to listen for. Her voice did not sound like a trap. It sounded like relief. And relief is another dangerous thing. When people sense salvage, they move. Convoys form like swarms. We tested the composition of our group and realized the pull of the hollow had a centrifugal force. Some wanted to go. Others, older or bound by illness, stayed and would be exposed if the raiders decided to target the empty streets. The decision hung between us like a patient animal that might bite or purr. The night before we planned to leave, a child came to the radio hatch and asked if I could tell a story about clouds shaped like animals. I told her one about a dog made of light who chased the horizon until the horizon learned to stop running. When I finished, she said, "Will you come back?" I lied and said yes. The truth is I didn't know. There are moments in which leadership is not the heroic decision but the prepared lie that keeps someone sleeping tonight. We left at dawn. Our convoy was modest. Ruth's rig with the pump, the brothers' pickup loaded with ballast and rope, Myra's small medical bag zipped tight, and me with my map and the radio secured in a waxed box. We lashed what we could to lower the center of mass and drove slowly, because haste in our world invites mistakes. The road was a document of decay. A school bus half submerged in mud, a billboard peeled like old skin, a field where grain used to be growing nothing but hardpan. The sky was a bruise, the light was thin. Halfway to the observatory, we found signs of other travelers, boot prints heading off toward the trees, a pile of 3 stones with a frayed black cloth fluttering like a hand. My heart did an odd, dumb thing. It stuttered with a hope that felt like a betrayal. We left a marker of our own and pushed on. Someone, maybe a child who had been following a feral dog, maybe an older forager, had been here before us. There were cigarette butts and a dented can of peaches. The closer we drew, the more the air changed. There was a metallic tang at the edge of the road and a hum like an animal thinking. Birds circled awkwardly and then dove away. And then, as if the world were listening to a different channel, the sky folded a little and a low groan moved along the trees. Tires hissed in a pattern I had come to dread. Someone ahead fired a warning shot. The convoy braked. On the ridge, shadowed by a ruined pylon, a shape moved. Not a raider yet, but the suggestion of one. A person with hands up, a hat in their hand, standing in a cleared line of sight. Then another shape, and then more. That is how tension mounts, in the human metric of approach. We had moved to hope, and hope had drawn attention. The road had become an answering bell, and someone was listening on the other end. Inside me, the choice I had rehearsed for nights folded into a singular, crystalline moment. Turn back and preserve what we have, the people who cannot travel, the stockpiles, the small network that keeps bread on some tables, or press on toward the hollow and the chance, however slim, of real water that might change what our ledger looks like for months. I tightened the straps on the radio box and felt like a man preparing to drown, with intention and a prayer. I keyed the microphone and spoke to the static as if it held all the answers. "This is Miles," I said, the words a steadiness I didn't always feel. "We're 5 clicks from the observatory. If anyone out there answers and is friendly, respond on the comer frequency. If you are hostile, do not fire. We bring water for everyone." My voice trembled in the line. The truth is that sometimes words are scaffolding. Sometimes they are the bridge. No answer came through the headset, only the static and the soft, indifferent groan of the planet. Then, faint and clear as a struck bell, a single voice said, "We remember the map. It doesn't solve anything, not yet. It is only a line in the dark, a small spark that both promises and threatens. But our wheels creaked forward. We drove into the unknown, because that is what we have left to do. And with each mile, the world rearranged itself. And with each rearrangement, I felt my old life slipping like sand. The rising action of this month is no single event, but a stack of them. The raid, the message, the decision to go. The tension is not merely outside. It is a slow pressure inside the chest, a tightening that will either tell me I was brave or that I was foolish. We do not get to know which until we get there. We only get to make the road and walk it, and to speak into the radio while doing so, because voices remember us better than maps ever will. They told us the observatory would be a ruin. They were right and wrong in the same sentence. The dome sat half buried in the valley like a closed eye. Its concrete skin was scored with lichen and the scars of lifts that had peeled the earth back like an orange. But at its base, tucked beneath a fractured service door, the world smelled impossibly, achingly like clean water. It smelled like the inside of a pipe that had been waiting a long time to remember its job. We found the shaft first, a stairwell carved into old stone that led down into a dark, cool mouth. The air grew sweeter as we descended, and when Arlo turned the final corner, there it was, a cistern the size of a small room, its surface glassy and still. It reflected us like a quiet planet. Light came down the shaft in a single narrow band, and in that band the water looked holy. I checked the usual things the way I had been taught by the Solstice Collective, and by every careful hand I have traded knowledge with over the past years. Bottle test, taste test, smell, stand and watch. We filled a clear bottle and left it to settle. No metallic tang, no film that told of oil or chemical runoff. I held the bottle to my nose and breathed the clean, cold smell of it and felt something in me unclench that had been wound tight for years. "Salt?" Ruth asked. Her hands didn't quite stop trembling even as she read the lines of the water like Braille. "Not that I can tell," I said. "No sting, no clouding. We'll still treat it, still boil if we have to." But I could not finish the sentence without the word salvation tripping out of me, so I let silence say it. For a dizzy half hour we moved like vultures of good intent, hauling collapsed metal and repurposed pulley, until a makeshift pump sat over the cistern. Hoss and the brothers rigged a hand-crank lifter from a length of rebar, and a pulley they scavenged from the observatory's old maintenance rig. Myra unspooled gauze and counted pills with a small, sun-faded certainty. Our tires were lined with sandbag ballast, our rigs lashed down. We worked with the careful frenzy of people who know how close the world might be to changing. Then the ridge spoke. It began with a sound I had come to dread, not the low hum that preceded a lift, but human noise arranged like intent. A shout, the staccato of a rifle, the The distinct, horrible chorus of men who have decided other people are resources. Raiders, moving with a coordination that felt like engine oil in an old machine. They had learned our roots. They had learned our rhythms. They had learned that where the rumor was richest, the risk was highest. Old Compass's voice came through my headset then, breaking a small patch of quiet. Miles, there's movement on the ridge. 2 groups looks like they're converging. We counted 5 pickups and a dozen riders. You have to secure the entrance now or they'll hit while you're still setting the pump. I could hear the weight of her sleep in the line. She had been right. Maybe she had been there before. The reality snapped across me. We had found water, but the map had already been read by others. The choice that hangs over the story, keep it for ourselves, or share it and risk everything, tightened like a wire. There were a dozen practical moves we could make. We could bury the shafts we had cut and cover them with stones, make the water hard to find but leave it for the local people who already knew the map. We could set the pump and move in secret, hauling small amounts back to our block over weeks. Or we could open the cistern and broadcast what we had found, offering to distribute water by convoy, and accepting that in doing so we painted a target on the dome. I think a man's soul shows in the way he measures risk against obligation. I thought of Lena's laugh and Theo's stubborn, grease-smeared hands. I thought of Jara's small insistence that clouds were animals, and that the world might still be soft enough to learn to be kind. I thought of Arlo, young, foolish, good, who had walked out into a raider's teeth once for us and had not come back. I thought of the nights I stayed at the transmitter instead of going with a search party, the way guilt sat in my chest like a stone. The radio in the waxed box at my side hummed like a quiet heart. It was an instrument of memory and connection. It was also, if I let it be, a way to call others into danger. We open it, I said finally, not asking anyone for permission because asking is sometimes a way of moving the burden from your hands to theirs. We take what we can and then we make a plan to share. We do it fair. We anchor it. We don't let them take it by surprise. Ruth nodded. She had seen pumps fail and watched people die when the rules of supply are weaponized. We set up a watch, she said. 2-hour rotations. Myra, you get the first. Hoss, you and the brothers set pickets on the ridge. Miles, you keep the radio going and call anyone you know who can help. Old Compass, if you can, give us overwatch. We did it with the clumsy grace of people who have nothing to spare but spare hands. We fed the pump, tested the output, and lugged the first buckets up into the boots of the trucks. The water came out clear and cold, and when it hit the bottom of a rusted kettle, the sound was almost obscene, a clean note in a long, brittle song. We had maybe 3 rotations of calm before the first line of raiders crested the ridge. They moved like a dark tide, and at their head was a man with a face half hidden by grease and bandana. He walked with the arrogance of a man who believed himself authorized by scarcity. They hit our perimeter not with the clumsy violence of thieves, but with a precision that suggested someone had taught them to read the world as a ledger. The firefight was awful and quick, and the kind of thing you store in your knuckles forever. We fired and they fired. A flare lit the night like a warning. Bullets found spaces they had not before. The pump whined and then stilled when a stray round nicked the pipe. Someone screamed. The sky did that strange thing that it does when the earth shifts, and for a heartbeat, gravity hiccuped, not enough to lift us, but enough to make every loose object take flight like something startled. It was in that tilt, with the world briefly forgetting its rules, that I made the choice that would mark me. I saw a raider coming for the pump. He moved like an animal toward the sound of life. My hands found a length of chain and I ran, because some impulses are truer than strategy. I slapped the chain around the pump's base and threw my weight into it, anchoring it to a fallen pillar that refused to float. The chain sang in the air. A bullet grazed my arm. I tasted copper and the sky made a peculiar sound like a held breath. Arlo was there then, appearing from the side like an answer. He had been wounded in the raid that took him before. His left arm hung in a strip of cloth. He had not been found earlier because he had been waiting in the shadows, guarding the path where the raiders might cross. He had scars on his face that money could not buy now, the kind of marks men earn when they learn to bleed sometimes for others. He saw me with the chain and he smiled, a small, terrible thing, and then pushed himself between me and the man coming for the pump. "He's mine," he said, and in that sentence were all the things he had never said when he was alive and whole. The raider moved toward him, and Arlo shoved a rusted pipe with the movement of a man who has nothing left to lose. The pipe cracked like a match, a shout, a collapse. Arlo didn't fall, he braced. His shoulder took the blow. I pulled. The chain bit and the pump held. The raider slid past and into Haas's net, where a rope and a thrown hook caught him, and the others tumbled like bad actors into a net they had not expected. We tied them, not out of cruelty, but because in our world cruelty is sometimes triage, and restraint is a way to survive a bigger cruelty. They kicked and spat and asked for names and reasons, and then later they were quiet. There were losses. 2 of our people were struck down, and I do not have a clean ledger for their disappearance. One lay in the dirt, and I pressed a hand to his chest until I knew whether there were heartbeats to count. There were some. There were some gone. The moment after the fighting, with sirens of geologic memory far off and our breaths stuttering in the thin light, Old Compass's voice came over my headset once more. "Miles," she said, and I could hear the relief like rain. "We see you on the grid. We have a convoy coming to help secure distribution. We'll be there within dawn. Hold the site." Holding became a new verb. We set a schedule: water for immediate people, reserves for shipments, and a guard to watch the pump every hour. We rationed like people who have learned from cruelty that extremes breed tragedy. We gave water to a woman whose baby drank and then stopped crying. We sent a small caravan back to the block with a promise carved into the lid of a jar. We share. It was a promise I had made to the radio and to the ghosts I keep. The burden of that promise felt like a stone in my pocket, and I welcomed it. The gravity distortions did not stop to applaud our courage. That night, when the convoy met us and old faces in new places crowded around, the sky folded and a low, slow tremor ran under our boots. The dome shuddered and a fissure cracked along the cistern's rim. Water hissed like a wounded animal. We worked with hands that trembled and minds that raced, sealing seams with tar and leather and prayers. Arlo stood with a shovel, bleeding, and laughed the laugh of people who are stubborn against fate. Myra watched him and said a prayer into his name like one might say a grocery list, practical and holding. We tied the pump in again, anchored cables to fallen pylons and to tires filled with concrete. We sacrificed what we could afford. The dynamo that ran the shortwave pumped hard and finally blew its winding. The radio went dead in my hands. For a moment I sat in a silence that felt like a vault. Then Old Compass's voice came back over a handheld she had. We heard the line go dead. "Miles, you have to switch to the secondary. You anchored the pump. You okay?" "I'm fine," I said, and the word was true in the way a splinter can be true. We had water. The radio was dead. I felt both losses, my chest a ledger. We had saved something that night and lost something else. Arlo's wound was bad. He would live, but the road home would be long and stitched. 2 men lay in the dust and would not rise. The raiders were bound and later turned over, their faces a geography of hunger and something cruel. The hollow cistern, patched and sealed, sloshed in the dark like a small, patient heart. Dawn would bring Old Compass's convoy and the promise of distribution. Dawn would bring lines and bargaining and danger too. There would be no easy endings. I sat on an upturned crate and looked at the water, reflecting the first thin light that managed past the bruised sky. I thought of Lena and Theo, and the night the river walked away. I thought of Jera, and how she might wake and ask for a cloud animal. I thought of the broadcasts I had lost when the dynamo died, 1,000 names unsaid for a night. The radio being dark was its own kind of grief, but so was the sight of people collecting water as if each bucket were a small holy thing. A choice is a narrow bridge that sometimes requires you to leave something behind to get someone else across. I had left the transmitter, at least for now, on a bench, its wires scorched like a letter that had been burned to keep something else from catching. I had not left my promise. I had anchored the pump with my hands and with Arlo's moving body, and in doing so I had traded the sound of my voice for the sound of water running into jars and boots and kettles. The trade felt fair in the bones of the morning. The climax is never tidy. It does not hand you a neat resolution and say, "Here is your reward." It gives you a catastrophic choice and you either make it or do not. We made ours. We defended the cistern. We shared the water. We lost radios and gained the sight of children drinking. We learned that even in a world where gravity forgets itself, people can remember how to be generous. Later, when the convoy left with jerry cans and a ledger and old compass waving from the lead truck, when the radio remained quiet under a blanket while I repaired its guts with coffee and small, careful hands, I sat and wrote names. Names are how we measure survival. Names are how we measure care. I wrote them into a notebook that I keep because paper remembers longer than the human throat in a crisis. Arlo slept with his hand on my knee like a promise. The pump breathed. The sky still bruised. The world had not been fixed. But for the first time in a long time, the map had a place on it where people might return and drink and not die that week. The radio was no longer our lifeline in that moment. Water was. And water had been won not by hoarding it, but by risking everything to keep it common. I made the choice I would later justify in small sentences and in nightly prayers. I would rather lose my voice than let a child die thirsty while I am able to do something about it. The world would keep distorting. People would keep making bad choices and worse ones. But that night, under the observatory's battered dome, with the pump anchored by chain and flesh and the radio dark, we crossed a narrow, dangerous bridge and came out with buckets full of miracle. The night after the raid and the pump seizure felt like a world exhaling and then holding its breath. Dawn spilled thin and gray through the observatory's broken dome, and the cistern caught the light and made of it something gentle, a promise, small and practical. People moved through the morning like folk waking from an accident, slow, careful, touching one another's shoulders as if to check that the other was truly still there. The immediate outcome of what we did was obvious and blunt. We had water, clean, cold, steady water enough to fill a crate of jerry cans and to wet lips that had not known ease in months. We rationed it at first, because rationing is how we buy tomorrow when tomorrow is uncertain. Each person received a measured share, and the first time I saw a child drink without coughing afterward, I felt a tightening in my chest that was not entirely sorrow or joy, but both. For a few days the block moved differently, less like a collection of people trying to survive and more like a small body coordinating for a common purpose. There were kitchens lit for longer, a woman mending a boy's torn coat with visible concentration instead of tremulous hands, and a small line at the infirmary where Myra balanced doses and smiles. That, for all its pleasantness, is the small arithmetic of survival. Hope arrives and so do tasks. The pump needed constant attention. Tar and leather patches do not last forever under shifting loads. Bolts work themselves loose when the earth decides to take a slight walk. We set a maintenance rota. Arlo, stubborn and stubbornly living, took the first shift despite the bandage on his arm. He worked as if the pump were a friend who might otherwise leave. And when he smiled between tightening screws, I felt the old, ridiculous fear that any human smile is somehow too fragile a thing to trust. Hoss and the brothers guarded the ridge in shifts. They grew less like soldiers and more like roots, anchoring the place with their presence. We had losses that did not fill the ledger with fairness. 2 men who had stood with us did not rise when the smoke cleared. We wrapped them with the mixture of ritual and practicality we still possessed. A small prayer in the language that had survived, a spade that dug the earth like a punctuation mark, and a name read aloud. Saying a name feels like a small rebellion against erasure. I read theirs slowly into the recorder. I could not yet fix the shortwave. but I wrote them into the notebook I carry, and then on a scrap of plywood we nailed to the observatory's door. A simple list of those who had died for something others would now drink. It is a ledger I will carry. There were complications, social and ethical, that arrived almost immediately. The raiders we bound were not all monsters. Some were younger than my nephew was in the world before. Some were mothers who had been conscripted into a life of theft to feed a child. In the first hours, their faces were a geography of hunger and anger. We debated what to do with them. Old Compass argued for a network solution. Take them to a council that would weigh justice and reparation. Other voices wanted blood. I felt that old, guilty geometry in my chest, the memory of nights I did not go out, the names I had not saved. In the end, the convoy that Old Compass brought took the prisoners to a neutral ground, a cluster of communes that had tried to set up a kind of trial system. It was not clean or perfect. The law in our world is improvisation and necessity. But it was something like communal judgment, and that small, procedural thing matters. The world is rebuilt in small rituals like that. Environmentally, the victory did not stop the distortions. The planet continued to cough and hiccup. A week later, a lift rolled through the valley in a slow, indifferent wave, and a portion of the observatory's outer stairs sheared off. We lost a cache of barrels to a Mies-timed tremor. The cistern itself shivered, and for a moment I was back in the old fear, that the water would vanish as quickly as it had appeared. That did not happen. We learned instead that we could adapt. We reinforced seams with leather, buried extra ballast, created a secondary catchment a little downhill in case the main cistern tore. The world was not healing. It was teaching us to be cleverer. That is a bitter sort of progress, but progress nonetheless. My personal change after the events felt less like a sudden conversion and more like slow accretion. I had always thought of myself as a man who listened. The radio was how I paid attention to the world and how the world paid attention to me. Trading voice for pump, literally, in the sense that the dynamo died and the shortwave went quiet, felt like a sacrifice. For a few days, silence wrapped around me like a wet cloak. I missed the rhythm of callers, the small rituals of reading names, the absurd comfort of telling the story of a dog who fetched a broken antenna. Once the dynamo failed, I felt hollowed. My hands wanted to spin the pedals that no longer made the transmitter sing. But something else shifted then, too. With the radio dark, I did not retreat into private guilt as much as I stepped into responsibilities that were larger than the microphone. I learned to hand a wrench and steady a ladder. I taught a dozen people how to splice a hose and how to read the pump's tremor before it fails. I wrote instructions on a scrap of tin. If the pipe sings, tighten these bolts, and nailed it behind the pump where everyone could see. The voice turned out to exist in more than one instrument. It lived in hands that repair and in people who remember the names of the neighbor's children. I had traded one way of being necessary for another. The radio will be repaired, of course. I found a piece of copper wire in the rubble and a speaker cone that hummed when I tapped it. The shortwave is patient. Technology in our world can be coaxed with coffee and time. But the hours without it taught me humility. Being useful is not always shouting into a microphone. Sometimes it is listening to an engine and saving the life that will pump water for 10 blocks. We set up small structures of governance around the pump. A rotating council of 3 offered oversight. 1 person from our block, 1 from the block 2 streets over, and a representative sent by Old Compass's wider network. They met under the dome and argued with fierce tenderness about who gets what and why. The conversations were uneven and punctuated with old hurts, but we had one rule that won broad assent. No single group could claim exclusive rights to the cistern. Water distribution had to be documented, ration cards were issued, a ledger was kept and signed with a thumbprint or a name. The rule was not foolproof. It was a start. The broader region changed, too. News of the hollow spread like a slow, eager plant. Caravans came and left. Some stayed to help and some stayed to take. The convoys that arrived with old compass helped to cart water deeper into the maps and to set up secondary catchments in other places that had once sung with wells but now whispered. Networks of barter tightened. Seeds for labor, batteries for medicine. We learned to be wary of quick abundance because it often carries the poison of new dependencies. Still, seeing a caravan arrive with 100 liters of water and a mechanic who knew how to keep pumps sealed felt like seeing the future for a second. Messy, imperfect, but possible. I do not pretend the situation is better in any grand sense. The planet still tilts in ways that defy old maps. Crops will fail, seasons will swerve. People get sick in waves, and the fragility of medicine is a constant pressure. The raider problem did not vanish. It transformed. Where there had been bands that took what they could, some converted to work for water deals. Others became more dangerous as they learned that where the water is, the line of sight to it invites violence. The world is stubbornly itself, cruel and kind in wild measures. What changed most in me is a strange knitting. Guilt was worn into a different shape. Before, guilt was a private thing I could carry like a stone in my pocket. Now, guilt is a ledger to be balanced with action. I cannot undo the nights I did not walk into the dark after Lena and Theo. I cannot bring them back, but I can name the dead at our door, hold a pump steady with a chain, and teach someone else how to solder a wire so that the radio will sing again next week. That is a different way of honoring memory. Practical acts become a prayer. I have nights still when the sky tilts and I dream of the bridge sliding like a page ripped from a book, and everything I loved slipping into the river. Grief is a companion that does not leave. It merely shifts its place at the table. But I also have mornings now where children run to the cistern and drag buckets back, laughing at something small and ridiculous, and I feel the tension loosen in my chest just enough to breathe. There is something holy about watching a child remember how to play. Nature did not heal, not in any grand arc. It did what nature does. It adapted, scrambled, and repopulated in new forms. Where the river no longer behaved, new puddles became ecosystems for stubborn fish. Vine and grass took over the ruins, not as a balm but as a new reality. The distortions continued, sometimes small, sometimes frightening, and we learned their language. The hum under the teeth, the birds' sudden collective panic, the way dust lifts like a signal. We set early warning posts and taught children the simple truth: if the birds panic, get to shelter and check the anchor lines. The radio will come back, and when it does, I will speak into it differently. I will still read names and still tell Jara about cloud dogs and horizon chasers, but I will also report the mundane, pump maintenance schedules, the ledger tallies, the times when the convoy will pass. My voice will be less theatrical and more managerial. I have learned that survival is not only a story you tell. It is a set of instructions you teach to anyone who will learn them. We are not healed. We are not safe, but we are less alone. That, in this geometry of a world that sometimes forgets its rules, is a profound thing. I look at the notebook where I write names and think of the iron fact that names keep people from being statistics. I look at Arlo sleeping with his hand on a tin of screws and think of the cost of that sleep. I look at the cistern and think of the odd miracle of a thing that is both fragile and stubbornly reliable when tended. When the sky shifts and the ground groans, I still reach for the radio reflexively, and then remember, it is on the bench, waiting for a winding that I will have to solder by hand. For now, my voice is in my hands and in the hands of others. We have water. We have a plan spoke in small, careful sentences. And for the first time in a long time, I can say that the ledger of our days includes things besides loss. If hope is fragile, it is also perverse. It will not die quietly. It insists on being practical. It wants a maintenance schedule and a watch roster and a list of names. It wants to be earned. We will earn it day by day with dirty hands and stubborn hearts. The world didn't forgive us that night, and it didn't bless us either. It gave us a cistern and took a radio. It let a pump breathe, and it stole two of us away. That is the shape of our victories now, partial, costly, and stubbornly real. I learned in the long hours after the fighting and the patching and the quiet that a single clean thing, a cup of water, a child's laugh, a fixed bolt, can be enough to hold a human heart steady for a week. Enough at least to pedal the dynamo when the sun is kind and keep the little flame of community from guttering. We found a rhythm, thin and careful, the kind you keep when you are trying not to wake a sleeping thing. The pump will need work forever, or at least until someone cleverer than I figures out how to make something permanent here. Arlo is alive and angry and healing, and he swears at me in small grins when I show him a new spanner. Ruth moves like a woman who has discovered the particular joy of being useful in a world that often insists usefulness be violent. Old Compass comes through with convoys when she can, and her people have become part of our rotating council. The council is messy and human, and in its mess, more honest than any bureaucracy I once knew. We argue about who gets how much water, and then we argue some more, and then we measure and we sign and we hand out cans. There is dignity in the ledger. I miss the radio more than I can measure. It sat on the bench, scorched and silent, and in that silence I learned a new language of usefulness. I can solder a winding now. I can splice a wire with hands that do not tremble when the light dips. I taught a young woman named Mara how to check a diode, and how to listen for a failing capacitor by the bird-like chirp it makes right before it goes quiet. The voice is coming back slowly. That will matter, because names still hold. I will not trade the sound of a child's name for any cistern that runs dry. Hope in this world is not a sermon. It's a ledger and a set of chores. It is 2 hours on guard at the ridge and 1 hour checking the pump. It is sewing a tarpaulin seam with hands that have cut themselves on old metal, and then patching the wound with boiled water and clean cloth. It is the repeated, boring work of maintenance. It is the ugly arithmetic of feeding people, and of deciding whether to send a convoy and how many jerry cans to spare. It is the quiet insistence that we will not let scarcity teach us to stop naming each other. We have also learned, painfully, to be cautious with miracles. The Hollow gave clean water. That does not mean the planet has learned to behave. Distortions still come. The sky still forgets what it is supposed to do, and sometimes it remembers in the middle of the night and upends part of what we've built. We plan for ruptures now. Secondary catchments, buried ballast, quick-release straps on pumps. We keep a black cloth and a stack of 3 stones at the ridge even if we don't use them, because signs are portable, and sometimes the map lives in small rituals. The hardest changes are in the small things inside me. Guilt is not gone. It lives under my tongue and sometimes bubbles up when I read names into the notebook and realize the list will never be complete. But guilt has become a lever. I make restitution where I can. I teach, I give. I push the chain into the ground and make anchors. I tell stories into the radio when I can, not to glamorize what we've lost, but to name it and thus keep it from being swallowed by silence. I have learned that naming is an act of compassion. If you can say someone's name, they are less likely to be turned into a statistic. There are small, fragile joys that survive. Children invent games with empty jars. An old woman taught a group of us to bake bread in a metal drum oven. And for the first time in months, the block smelled like a kitchen that remembered holidays. Someone painted a crude mural on the observatory door, a dog chasing a cloud. And when Jara saw it, she laughed so hard her face split open with light. Those moments are not repairs for the planet. They do not bring back the river, but they are stitches in the social fabric, and fabric is what makes us shelter out of weather. I will not pretend I have any illusions about a final fix. The distortions will continue. The raiders will adapt. Some will become traitors, some will become worse. Disease will find us in cycles, and medicine will be a story of cunning and sacrifice. We do the work we can. Keep the pump sealed, ration water fairly, keep the radio alive, teach others how to do what we've learned. We document everything. We leave maps on metal and send them with convoys. We teach children the signs of a lift and the taste of clean water so they will know what to fight for when the need comes. My last broadcasts, for now, are practical. I give times for distribution. I read medical tips and recipes because food is memory. I read names and addresses and places where people promise to leave a candle on a porch to signal a safe house. But sometimes, when the gear is wound and the line is clear, and someone answers with a steady voice, I tell a short story about a cloud dog that chased the horizon until the horizon promised to slow down, about a man who learned to solder a radio so his neighbors could wake to a name. Stories are small acts of insistence. They tell us we are more than bills and ledgers. They remind us that there was, and still is, beauty worth the cost of a wound. If you are listening, and there are nights I broadcast into a silence so deep it could be the planet thinking, know this. Do what you can and teach what you can. Anchor your roofs. Learn to read the birds. Share water when you can, but document it. Name the people you love out loud. Teach a child one practical thing and one foolish, soft thing, how to spin a dynamo and how to make a cloud dog from his breath in the cold. Keep records. Keep rituals. Keep watch. Hope is not a promise. Hope is a set of tasks turned into habit. It is the stubbornness to repair a radio, the humility to hand a wrench to a neighbor, the courage to anchor a pump at the risk of being shot. It is the willingness to sit with grief, and also to laugh when a child makes a game of the ledger. Those are small arms against a world that still forgets its rules. Tonight, I will pedal the dynamo for a little while longer. I will wind the radio and speak a few names into the static. I will check the pump lines and then sit with a small tin of coffee and listen to people plan their days. Dawn will come bruised and slow as ever. We will wake and we will do it again. That is what survival looks like now: repetition, care, and the fierce, quiet insistence on being humane. So if you find this voice on the air, hold to it. If you hear my name called back, answer with your own. Feed the children. Fix the lamp. Anchor your doors. Tell a story to anyone who will listen. The planet may forget the rules sometimes, but we can choose not to forget how to be human. This is Miles for now and for as long as I am able to keep a hand on the chain. Keep your names. Keep your hands. Keep going.